to follow through on those opportunities, and then give us the words as well to be able to know exactly what to say to each one of those. For the ones, Lord, who aren't in church this morning for whatever reason, the ones that aren't there because they're just kind of laying out today and they didn't feel like getting up and have gotten into the habit of coming, Lord, we pray that you'll put a desire back in their heart and make them uncomfortable this morning so that they can see their need to be back in church with us and get back in the habit of coming to your house. Or for the ones who can't be here because they're caring for loved ones or have work situations or have different things going on that they can't help but be here, Lord, we pray that you'll move in those situations, allow those things to work out so they can be here with us as we know that they want to be. Lord, we're thankful for our Sunday school class this morning as we continue our study here in the book of Romans, as we finish up our lesson from last week and look at a few things on the book of Romans, Lord. And as we continue to move through this for the next few weeks, that you'll just teach us something from it, Lord. Again, recall back to our memory things we've forgotten. Most importantly, Lord, allow it to influence us in our relationship with you, Lord. And of course, as always, Lord, I pray that you're moving from the situation up here. Things that are said don't come from me, Lord, they come from you. In your name I pray. Amen. Go ahead and turn to Romans chapter 1. Last week I told you I'd have a PowerPoint for you. I'm still working on that. I promise I'll get that eventually. For you visual learners. Romans chapter 1. We're going to finish up our lesson from last week. We've got 3 more points, or 2.5 points, I guess, that we need to go through to kind of start this introductory lesson here on the book of Romans. And then, if you still have your drawing from last week that we talked about, the illustration I kind of gave you of the gear and how that kind of turns and works, I'm going to be mentioning that some more. We got a couple more parts of that we're going to have to look at. So if you still have that, you can go ahead and grab that. If you don't have that, if you weren't here with us last week for whatever reason, essentially if you can draw a gear on the back of your bulletin or on a scrap sheet of paper, where in the middle of the gear is a circle, and that is where Christ is at. On the outside of the gear, there are 4 half moons that go around, 2 here and 2 here, and then the outside of that is the actual gear that would kind of go on to something and help crank around, kind of like a hand crank or like one of those old-timey grinders. You kind of know what I'm talking about. Kind of have those gears that work. That's kind of the idea, the illustration I kind of want you to kind of at least have in your mind as we go through this first lesson. This is the illustration that they use, and I thought it was a pretty good one. And as we were kind of starting this last week, I'll go back just very quickly as a review over what we went over last week. At the very center of that gear, of course, is Christ. Now, the book of Romans, and the writer here, Paul, the writer of Romans, was a lot of there had been some debate over the last couple of months about the authenticity of Christ even coming and being like an actual historical figure, and that there's people who debate that and talk about that, how it didn't really happen, he wasn't true. As a matter of fact, if you go on to YouTube or probably on Facebook, and you may have seen this, this is just to kind of show how far we've came. The little Alexa things, the Amazon, what I'm talking about. You talk to it, the speakers in your home. It's the Alexa, whatever it is, and it tells you the temperature. We've all seen the commercial for that. We all know what I'm talking about, the Amazon Alexa thing. If you don't know, it's a little box that goes in your house, and you can just talk to it, and it plays music for you. Alexa, play this song, or Alexa, give me this recipe, and it goes online, and it gives you the information that you want. And they're really cool. And if you got a Fire Stick that you plug into your TV, you can just talk to the remote, and Alexa bring up whatever. It's a really interesting, really neat little thing. Well, there's some gentlemen that did an experiment with this Alexa. And they were just asking it some questions. And if you saw this, if you haven't, you need to go on and look this up. But they got to asking it some I guess political questions and some religious questions, and just kind of see what some of the answers were. And the first question that the couple guys who were just sitting around drinking coffee and trying this thing out asked Alexa if Alexa knew who Muhammad was. And it went through this really detailed explanation of the prophet of Islam and all this stuff, and went through this big, huge just, I guess, talking about who Muhammad was and what he did and all kinds of stuff. And then they asked about Muhammad's wife, and they went through this huge list of all these things. Then it asked, well, who is Buddha? And it went through this who Buddha was and kind of about the whole religion. Then they asked, Alexa, who's Jesus Christ? And Alexa repeated, Jesus Christ is a fictional character. And it cut off. And so they asked it again, thinking, well, maybe it didn't understand. And Alexa, who is Jesus Christ? And it says, Jesus Christ is a fictional character. And that was the end of the answer. So these guys put this on YouTube, right? Because these are two Christian guys, just conservative, they have talk shows, and I like to listen to them. They're pretty interesting. So they put this on YouTube on Black Friday. And there was a huge outcry amongst people, atheists, people who don't believe in Christianity, saying that they had faked this video in some way, that they had kind of put it together in a certain way that was this big hoax. So they released another video with the complete raw footage. They didn't edit anything. And it showed again Alexa 2 different occasions saying that Jesus Christ was a fictional character. And obviously, you may have seen this. It blew up, right? It's gone viral. And now, because of the outcry, Amazon has changed the answer. They went into the little box and they have changed the answer, and it actually talks a little bit about who Jesus Christ is. Which I thought was pretty interesting. Because, especially as we're starting this study in the book of Romans, and we talked specifically last week, right? The gospel doesn't happen if Christ isn't in the center of it. And just as I saw that video and listening to some of the follow-up on it as well with a couple of guys talking both sides of the aisle and all the things that they do, the one gentleman made the statement that, they actually, on the talk show this week, went in and said, all right, let's take Jesus Christ and let's give him a historical, let's prove that he was actually a historical figure. Because a lot of people, especially in universities that are being taught today, don't consider Christ to be an actual person. Just stories that we have from the Bible. So there has been some great debate even in the last week, and maybe you haven't seen. I read and listen to a lot of this stuff because I like to do that. But they've had lots of debates on some of these kind of minor talk shows on how Christ is in fact a historical figure, and they're proving with some of the stuff that was going on. And as I was studying for this week and knowing that we're going through the book of Romans and what during even the time period here of the 30s to 60s AD when Christianity was really kind of starting to get its grasp on society and people were really fighting it. And Paul was really kind of having to do, and the other apostles were really having to do some work to spread this gospel. I thought to myself, if Christ hadn't came, if Christ wasn't real, if this event didn't happen, then these dudes that wrote this and talked about this, they wouldn't have died for it. But they did. They died for what other people now are calling a hoax or something that wasn't true. And the influence that this moment in history has had on all of civilization from this point forward, when Christ left, he really wasn't very successful, right? When he ascended into heaven, how many followers did he actually have? It wasn't very many. And even some of the ones that said there were followers even had denied him. So he really wasn't very, very successful as he was here and as he left. But with these people who took this, had this experience, understood the truth of what Christ was preaching and talking about, and then taking it. How did it get to us? How did it get to Clinchco? It's because these guys, right, these people, these men and women were dedicated to the cause of understanding what a change what a change in their lives it was to know Christ. And most of them died for it and went through a whole lot of persecution for it. And it led me to the next step is, it got here because of these gentlemen. And a lot of people have suffered for it, and a lot of people have died for it. What am I doing for it? I'm in that gear. I'm part of the commission, right? I'm a Christian. I'm part of this thing. It's my duty, as I told you last week. It's a great responsibility. It's a great opportunity, but it is a duty for us to make sure that we are spreading the gospel as well. And that doesn't necessarily just mean talking about it. It's making sure that I'm living in that way. And as you think about Paul and the other guys, and even all through history, of the people who have died for this cause, And we don't have to really worry about that so much, but how dedicated am I as a Christian? How dedicated is we now as Christians living in the age that we're living? How dedicated are we to making sure that this gear keeps turning? We're influential. We're part of the cause. Right? Christ has called us to spread this thing. How much are we doing? Or how much more could we be doing? All right, and so we saw Christ being the commander here of the gospel, and we saw him choosing Paul, and we talked about the history of Paul last week, and of course we know the story very well, the road to Damascus, and meeting Christ blinding him, and then him being a persecuting of Christianity to being one of the great missionaries and one of the great defenders of the faith through all of history. And we kind of saw that change in Paul. Paul probably before he was a Christian was making good money, was being very successful in what he was doing. He was well renowned for his intellect and his knowledge. But he wasn't really suffering a whole lot. And he wasn't really kind of putting himself out there. He was kind of just doing the status quo. And then he met Christ, right? And then we see the great change in that. So Jesus last week, the commander of the gospel, he's the center of it as well. And then we finished up by looking at and talking about Jesus being the commissioner of the gospel. And as we get into this, we kind of finished up last week at verse 5. I want us to go back here and read the first 17 verses here of Romans, because that's kind of the scripture text here that this lesson kind of deals with. And let's kind of go through this, and I'll give you the last 2 points that we have, and then I'll be finished up for today. Verse 1 here of Romans, and we're going to go down to verse 17. Let's read this together, please. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he had promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, which was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection of the dead, by whom we have received grace and apostleship, for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name, among whom are ye also the called of Christ. To all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, that your faith is spoken out throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, who I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request, if by any means now at length I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto you. For I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift, to the end of you may be established. That is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith both of you and me. Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. I am a debtor both to the Greek and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from the faith to the faith, as is written, that the just shall live by faith. Now, we finished up last week kind of in the middle of Jesus being the commissioner of the gospel message, and that was in verses 5, 6, and 7. And one of the last questions that we kind of mentioned last week as we were talking about this was why is the commission to share the gospel such a gracious gift from God? And we answered that by saying that the commission allows the believers to be involved in the work that is ongoing. Right? It allows the believers to be involved in a work that brings eternal blessings, and allows the believer to be involved in a very, very important work here on earth. Okay, and what might a true believer who sees Christ's commission to share the gospel as a burden, or is even maybe can be sometimes even thought of as a punishment, but those type of believers or that believers kind of have an earthly focus and not really have a focus on the eternal. All right, so to finish up that Jesus kind of being the commissioner of the gospel, the goal here of Paul's work as an apostle was to bring about obedience in faith. And we talked about this obedience in faith a little bit last week, and obedience to the faith. And he mentions it in verse 5. Okay, this obedience to the faith. And we see by whom we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith. Now, what does the phrase obedience to the faith mean exactly? What Paul is saying here, what he's stating when he says this in verse 5 is that a person has no ability to obey God without faith. Right? We can't obey God without faith. And the fact that we have faith will in turn show our obedience to God. So that's what he's mentioning here in the obedience to the faith. As a believer who has faith in God, he will obey Him by sharing the gospel wherever Christ sends him to share the gospel. Now, to our missionaries that we talk about, Christ has sent them somewhere overseas, and they're sharing the gospel wherever they're at. Right now, for us in this room, God has us in Clinchcova or wherever we live at, and He has us in our workplace or around the people that we're around, whatever it is, wherever we're at. He has us there for a specific reason, and that specific reason is to share the gospel. Right? We have that commission to do that. I mentioned last week, 80 kids I'm involved with every day. One of the things I try to make sure is that along with teaching them the stuff they have to know in school, that I'm also being a positive Christian influence to them, because Christ has called me to be a teacher right now. Right? He's called me to be involved with a bunch of kids. So I got to make sure that within that, I am influencing them for Christ as well. It's the exact same responsibility that each of you have too. You have that responsibility. People you're involved with, people you're around with, your family members, whatever it is, you have a responsibility to make sure you are spreading the gospel. All right. Paul goes on to address the believers in Rome specifically in verse 6, because of course he's writing the book of Romans to them. And he said that they were in verse 6, among whom ye are what? He called them what? Called, we see that in verse 6, called of Jesus Christ. Now, the phrase called of Jesus Christ here, he uses this phrase for them, same thing for us as the readers, to show them, give them the idea of ownership. Right? Christ has called them to do this, so they should own up to this calling. They have some ownership in this calling. They were added to God's family and have been enlisted in Christ's workforce as messengers of the good news. They were saints, the set apart ones we see in verse 7. To all that be in Rome, the beloved of God, called to be saints. Saints, the set apart ones, to be accomplishing Christ's work on earth. Okay? So, with the gear, again, back to that illustration, we said Christ is at the middle, but the lines of the drawings that we've done are made up of us. It's made up of Christians. Right? We're the working parts of the gear that help the thing turn. We turn the machine. Now, the machine doesn't turn, the gear doesn't work if there's not parts in there that can connect. All right? We're the connecting parts. We're the ones that help this gear turn. It's our job to make sure that we are doing that. Our fourth thing here is that Jesus is the controller of the gospel movement. Jesus is the controller of the gospel movement. And we see this is in verses 8 through 15. Jesus as the controller of the gospel movement. Now, Paul here is expressing to these believers in these verses, he first of all expressed thanks to God for the Romans because of their faith. Look at verse 8. He says, first of all, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Their faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Now, at this time, the whole known world would be the Roman Empire. Right? That's the big dog of the period. They have control. They have their fingerprints pretty much everywhere throughout the world. Roman Empire is the great empire at this time. And people knew about these Christians in Rome. Right? If you go back and look at some of the stuff that was going on in the early ADs with some of the emperors and stuff, Christianity was really kind of starting to get its foothold. As a matter of fact, I don't remember the exact emperor, but he was kind of causing, when Rome burned in AD 63, You historians, I think it was AD 63 when Rome actually started to burn. The emperor at the time blamed Christianity for it. These Christians, these crazy people, they're the reason for this going down. So Paul is thanking them and commending these Romans here because they're small in number of the Christians that were in Rome, but they were casting a really bright spiritual beam in a lot of places. And he's commending them for that. Wherever Paul went, he heard about the firm, remarkable faith of the saints and of the Christians that were in Rome. Let's read verse 8 again. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Why was it here appropriate for Paul to give thanks to God through Jesus Christ for the proclamation of the Roman believers' faith in Him? Why is it important for him to do that? Why is it appropriate for Paul to kind of commend them on what they were doing there in Rome? Exactly. Thanking Him for not just the fact that they were showing up and going to church every day, but they're thanking Him for their actions as well. Because they were obviously, while small in number, with a great population of Rome, these people were having an impact. They were having an impact on the ones that were around them when it came to spreading the gospel message. So Jesus, the controller of the gospel movement, but both the spread of the gospel to the unbelievers and the effects of the gospel in the life of believers, He works in the lives of believers and magnifies His name through their work. We as Christians are called to magnify God. We as Christians are called to imitate Christ, right? When one of the emperors in Rome kind of gave the Christian their name of these mimicking of Christ, these little Christ, that was meant to be a mocking thing, but it actually is a great description of what we are supposed to be. We are supposed to be magnifying Christ in our lives all the time, imitating everything that He has done and everything that He does has done for us. And so by telling them that and recognizing that they are doing that, spreading that, that's how we as Christians can magnify Christ in our name, or through how we as Christians can magnify Christ by living a life that is honoring and pleasing unto Him. And that's why also Paul was so fervent here in the prayer for these guys. Verse 9, right? He says, "For God is my witness, who I am served with my spirit in the gospel of the Son, that without ceasing," He's doing what for these believers? It's mentioning you always in prayer. He's always praying for these believers in Rome. And why do you think he was always praying for them? Because of the persecution that was going on, because he understood the difficulties that their faith was being tested. He understood that there was a lot of Jewish people in Rome who didn't like what they were talking about, did not agree at all with what Christ had said. There was the Roman Empire who was very much against them. They had a ton of bad stuff going for them, but yet they were still flourishing. People were still being saved. They were still spreading the gospel. So he was very quick to make sure that he was recognizing any type of fruit in their life would come through Christ continuing to work in their lives. Paul recognizes that God works through people. Paul was recognizing that God works through people, and he wanted to go to Rome and meet these believers who were having this impact so that he could have a direct path in their faith, a direct involvement in their faith as well. Verses 10 and 11, right? He says, "Making a request, if by any means now at length I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto you, for I long to see you, and may impart unto you some spiritual gift to the end that ye may be established." Now, Paul uses the term there in verse 11, spiritual gift, and he uses it to describe the agent of change that he would bring to the Roman believers. All right, by doing so, by mentioning this, he put the emphasis on God, spiritual gift. He put the emphasis on God as the agent of change. Paul did not believe that he himself had any natural abilities or talents that could affect the true change in the Roman believers. All right, but he wanted to go to them to help edify them, to help give them his spiritual gift that God had given him to help them continue to do the work that is there. He actually even humbly anticipated being encouraged and spiritually strengthened through the ministries in his life, verse 12, that is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith that is in both you and in me. But all of that was on hold at the time, right? Paul wasn't able to get there. All that was on hold because God had not yet made a way for Paul to get to Rome. And we see in verse 13 that statement, "Now I would not have ignorant brethren, but oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was left hitherto that I might have some fruit among you also, even among the members of the Gentile." Every time he wanted to make a trip to Rome, kind of the history of Paul here. Every time he wanted to make a trip to Rome, God had stepped in and put him and sent him in a different direction. Had a different plan for God's life. Now, Paul had a desire to get to Rome, had a desire to minister to these Christians, had a desire to go and help them. But God had always intervened and put him in a different path or had a different plan for him in his life. And the reason that is that God specifically directs believers to move in a specific place, and had, for Paul's instance here, he had direct specific places that he wanted Paul to minister to. He had specific people as well that he wanted Paul to be ministering to. He wished he could go to Rome to meet the believers, but that was not part of God's plan for him at this point in Paul's life. Now, with that, Paul was obligated to minister to the Gentiles, whether they be Roman citizens, which are called the Greeks, or they be considered barbarians, which is what the people who lived in other parts of the world. That's why we see in verse 14, he says, "I'm a debtor both to the Greek," so the Roman citizens, and to the barbarians, the other parts of the world, both to the wise and to the unwise. So Paul here, he's not wasting his time with his barbarians while he was hindered in going to Rome to preach to the Greeks. In fact, you could say that his ministry to the barbarians, to these other people, took precedence for his time over the ministry of the people in Rome. Christ would let Paul go to Rome to preach the gospel when the time was right. And until then, he made sure the believers in Rome knew that he was longing to be with them, and that God would be preparing him for many years. But Paul stated that we see the attitude of his heart here in verse 15. "So as much as me is in me, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are in Rome also." So we see the attitude here. He was voluntarily preparing his heart for when he got there to be with them, whatever the involvement was. And that eventually, of course, cost Paul his life. He was going to be God's ambassador in Rome. Right? So we see Christ controlling the gospel movement. We see Paul recognizing that as well, and the importance of what the Roman believers were doing during that time. Last thing I have is the last part of the gear as well. So we got Christ at the middle of it. We have he is also the commissioner of it, and he uses us to kind of convey this gospel mission, and we're kind of part of the gear that helps work. We're the people involved with what's going on. And then the last thing is that Jesus is the conveyor of the gospel's might. Jesus is the conveyor of the gospel's might, and we see this in verses 16 and 17. Now, picking up here on the same theme, that the gospel is not just for a certain set of people. The gospel is for everybody, just like Paul stated. And he said that it was, verse 16, that he's not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God to salvation to everyone that believeth. Okay? Both first to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. So picking up on the same theme here, that the gospel is for everyone, Paul stated that he was not ashamed of that fact. That everybody needed to hear and be involved with the gospel. He was not ashamed of that fact at all. Why might someone be ashamed of the gospel? Why might somebody be ashamed of the gospel? For Paul to make this statement, right, in verse 16, I'm not ashamed of it, so why would somebody be ashamed of it? What? Persecution? What are other reasons people might be ashamed of the gospel? Persecution is a good one. What are some other ones?
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. Is the gospel message pretty simple?
They're not background. They're not rooted enough.
Not rooted enough in it to back up what they're trying to say. So the gospel message is pretty simple, right? I mean, it really is. It's a pretty simple message. And because the message was so simple, and because its central figure, Jesus Christ, right? What was his what his mannerisms, his attitude, his personality? What was Christ's personality like? Humble, lowly, servant. Understood that suffering was a part of life. What was he teaching while he was here? He was teaching mercy. He was teaching, putting others first, which up to this point, if you go back and look at history, would mercy have been considered a strong personality trait? Absolutely not. Would being a servant of somebody else be considered a strong personality trait? Absolutely not. Right? This was completely counter to everything that these people had kind of known their entire lives. The central figure was lowly. He was considered to be this delusional Jew who the Romans actually had crucified. What else is being taught during this time as well? The Greek and Roman philosophy, right? And that's considered what? If you're a Greek, Roman philosopher, if you're following after Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and these guys, you're considered to be what? A high-level thinker, right? You're a little more intelligent than the average bear. You're a little better off than everybody else. And this was completely counter to everything that they were teaching. They considered the gospel and considered Christ's message to be foolish, and they thought it was foolish to put their faith in a failed insurrectionist. All right? To these guys, Christ had failed. People of Rome were saying that Christ actually didn't resurrect, that the disciples, his people, were involved in it. It was all this big hoax. And he didn't do what he said he was going to do. So you were an idiot if you were going to follow after what this guy had been talking about for the last couple of years. But Paul was anxious to get the opportunity to preach the gospel in Rome. He understood that the gospel unleashed God's power to save the lost. And he was the main exhibit. His testimony was the main exhibit of this high-level, high-thinking Jew who thought he had everything figured out. And he realized that everything he had been chasing after for the first however many years of his life was completely useless and completely pointless until he met Christ. And then he saw true change. And he wanted to make sure that other people, everybody around him, he wanted to make sure they understood that important fact as well. That the things of this world, the earthly things that we consider to be really important, are really not that important. It only matters after we follow Christ. He was Exhibit A. The gospel power had changed his life. Christians found it hard to believe that the Saul of Tarsus, people in Rome knew who Saul was. He was the guy holding the coats when Stephen got stoned. He was the guy that was rounding these Christians up and persecuting them. They knew who Saul was. And it was a crazy thought to think that Saul of Tarsus, the great persecutionist, is now the Exhibit A defender of the faith. The very people he had been spending so many years persecuting, now he is trying to get other people to follow into the people that he was just persecuting. And he saw the importance of that, and he knew the power that was. Everything the man thought he knew was changed on the road to Damascus. And he had a determined, innate, he just had a drive and a desire to make sure that everybody else experienced the exact same thing. The most notable example of power in Paul's day was the Roman army. The Roman soldiers used brute force to beat their enemies into submission. They enforced Roman rule by terror, slaughtering any group in power or any group who tried to resist them. By comparison, the gospel's power brought deliverance, freedom, hope, and peace. Therefore, Jesus is the conveyor of the gospel's powerful might. Through him, God gives the believer the power over sin and death. He declares the believer righteous and alive instead of sinful and dead. Verse 17, and we'll finish this up. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. The condition for receiving the righteousness is just simply faith. It's just faith. Now, the catalyst for the growth of believers, also faith. That is why Paul used the phrase from faith to faith in verse 17. From first to last, from the beginning to the end of it, the Christian life is a matter of faith in God. So I see here the very first lesson here in our book of Romans, of kind of getting this thing started off with, is that Christ is the commander of the gospel mission. He's the center of the gospel message. He's the commissioner of the gospel messengers, controls the gospel movement, and then he is the conveyor of the gospel's might. And we as Christians have a duty and a responsibility to making sure that we are spreading that same gospel. The Romans could do it in the face of Nero throwing them on stakes and burning them for lamps in the middle of the night. The Romans could still do it. I think we can too. How much are we? How dedicated are we? How much are you doing, or how much are you not doing to help spread the gospel message of Christ? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson here of Romans, Lord, and what we've been able to look at, Lord. And I pray that as we continue to move through this, that we just really, I don't want to say relight the fire, because it should nearly burned out. But you help stoke it. But you help stoke it up, Lord, and get it to where it's just everything about us, Lord, everything we do, Lord, is a desire in us to make sure we're spreading the gospel message to everyone that's around us. That people know, Lord, people know what we're all about. And it's going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to make us step out of our comfort zone, maybe face some fears. So I pray that when those times come, when we have these opportunities and we're a little bit shy and we kind of back off of the opportunity that you presented in front of us, Lord, I pray that just like Paul was not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, that we also won't be ashamed of it, Lord. And that we'll follow through on being the conveyors here, being the gears that help turn this gospel message. I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next hour as well, for the ones that will be coming in for our morning service, Lord, that you'll just use him in a mighty way. To keep us attentive, Lord, not just with our ears, but our hearts as well, tuned into exactly what you'd have for us this